And so the MDC has now gone to Zimbabwe's constitutional court trying to have this election outcome overturned. Is there any prospect of success at this point?
Yeah, good to talk to you, Tamakili. I've seen the deposition, at least its first draft, and it looks like a pretty strong case, ranging from everything from intimidation in the rural areas to the press, the way it's been biased against the MDC, to the counting itself. It's pretty comprehensive. So I would think, I mean, I'm not a legal expert, I'm not a constitutional expert, but to me it seems fairly, it seems a good case. So then of course you have to ask, do you have a constitutional court which is independent? Like in Kenya, the constitutional court overthrew the results and you had another election. And the Uhuru said, well, you know, it's just an imperialist court stacked full of Western liberals. So it'll be very interesting to see what goes on in those presentations. So I think the respondent, Emmerson Mnangagwa, and the other presidential candidates have either 48 hours to respond. Then the case is set out, and the Constitutional Court has up to 14 days to decide. Now, let's say they do decide the results were not the way the ZEC put them out. Might there be a runoff? Might there be a 48, 45, difference between the presidential candidates? Then would there be a runoff? That could be, but there can be other choices made. So then you may get a lot of horse trading going on. So you'd be back in a situation much like 2008.
And you look at the margins of these elections, some are saying it was always going to be a close one to call, and Emmerson Mnangagwa, Zanu PF got, just over 50% of the vote. The MDC-Alliance came in at just about 44. Would that then be, you mentioned a runoff, something that can be resolved perhaps through a mere recount of the votes if, as you're saying, one of the issues that the MDC is saying here was a problem is how the votes were counted and allocated?
Yeah, I think in their document they have enough numbers to suggest that a recount would indicate a different result. So that could be put forth. But again, they have a whole rift of other conditions because the Constitution says elections must be free and fair. So you have all those other problems, which they've gone, from problems with the voters' roll, from problems with the Zanu PF getting hold of people's cell phone numbers from the biometric registration and phoning people up. In the rural areas, many people are intimidated. I think it mightn't be a bad idea if some organization like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International actually assisted in the process of getting a number of witnesses in rural areas to intimidation. Now, those people would be very scared, so you'd probably have to offer them asylum in some other country, not Zambia, because they refused tendiaibiti earlier in the week. So there's a whole gamut of contingencies here. And we should remember, too, that in the past, efforts in front of the Constitutional Court have not been successful. So the head of the Constitutional Court, Luke Malaba, I remember in 1986, I think, meeting him as a reporter, a cub reporter for the Bulawayo Chronicle. He's an impressive guy. He's made some very good judgments, but he's made some pretty shaky judgments when it comes to pushing the regime to the wall on an election issue like this. So one cannot have full faith in the Constitutional Court. So maybe we end up like you had AC Lumumba on your show last night saying that it's theatrics. I think it's a lot more than theatrics. It's a contest here between constitutional democracy and a military regime. While this constitutional process is going on, it's quite likely that the military will be still, rounding up people in the townships. I mean, there's still a lot of people in hiding from with the MDC, changing houses every night, that sort of thing. If it's interesting, there's no inauguration tomorrow, right? That's kind of an interesting victory for the MDC. But President Cyril Ramaphosa has ticked off in his diary that he's stopping off in Harare on Sunday on his way back from the DRC or wherever.
So what does Cyril Ramaphosa, our president, then say during the stopover in Zimbabwe, and does his voice carry any weight with all of the political parties involved in this, both the MDC and Zanu PF?
Yeah. Well, we shall see. He's made a good announcement about having no more violence and that sort of thing. The negotiations will always be interesting. They have in the past with Mbeki and Zuma, and I think the South African government has always fallen back on the issue of peace and security. And there's this false dichotomy in much of the international community between peace and security and democracy. Democracy, we might just have too much of a mess. Peace and security, you go with the guys in power. But that doesn't work. I mean, it didn't work in 2000, and actually I would suggest that South African policies vis-a-vis Zimbabwe have led to the steam building up. If you just let democracy take its root, it's going to be problematic. It's no bed of roses that appears overnight like the West thought after the Cold War. But you let that steam out, you let people engage with that political space, you let a parliamentary process develop without, in 2008, I think, there were all sorts of false charges against the MDC MPs. So you take them out, you kind of get them out of parliament. You just create a functioning political system. I think that's been a big mistake. But then again, the South Africans might say, well, look what happened in 2008 when they were really quite divided about what to do about that last runoff. In the end, they chose to go with the constitutional mandate and have a runoff. That resulted in 170 people being killed by Zanu PF people. If they had gone for a unity government even before that runoff, which was the other option they were considering, maybe you would have had more peace. And if you had had a quick result, a quick ending to that GNU, because that GNU gave Zanu PF 5 years to really reconsolidate and put the MDC in service ministries, and the finance ministry, which Tendai Biti had, was actually not doing much because the money from the minerals was coming to Overturn Mpofu. So he had his parallel finance ministry. So if you had a deal made for a GNU, which is actually what the British and many people were suggesting during the coup, a quick one, a year maybe, and just get the democratic process on its feet again, because the MDC coming into the running very soon after Morgan Tsvangirai died, and the alliance is put together and it's quite shaky. They will have a Congress in January, and they may get tighter. But these are just speculations. We really don't know what's going to happen in the Constitutional Court, and we don't know how independent the Constitutional Court is.
Okay, Prof, so much that we could still unpack about Zimbabwe, but thank you so much for coming in this morning. That was Professor David Moore. He is from the Department of Anthropology and Development Studies at the University of Johannesburg, helping us then just better understand the situation in Zimbabwe as we continue to digest the news that the country's presidential inauguration planned for tomorrow has now been postponed due to a court challenge by the MDC. Let's just